She was born Yelisaveta Andreevna Ivanovskaya in 1910 in Chisinau, Bessarabia, which was then part of the Russian Empire and is now the capital of Moldova. But I'm very grateful she amended her name to the more Western-sounding Elizabeth Ivanovsky when she emigrated to Belgium in 1932 at the age of 22. Other than her date and place of birth, nothing is recorded of her life before that point. But the purpose of her relocation to Brussels was to enable her to study at the city's Higher Institute of Architecture and Decoration, also known as La Cambre. Ivanovsky was studying both book illustration and theatre design, and even while still a student, she created her first illustrated children's picture book titled Circus in 1933. It featured a series of absorbing, quite daringly abstracted images of various performers, which set the graphic tone for the bulk of her other illustrations and helped to get her into similar work straight from graduation. Her chosen style at this time had been strongly influenced by the pioneering modernist work of the Russian artist and illustrator Vladimir Lebedev, whose own children's book, also titled Circus, had been published in 1925. Following her graduation from the book illustration part of her studies in 1934, she illustrated Death in the Soul by Frans Helens, with some atypical and not overly impressive woodcuts. But in the same year, the children's book Grand et Petit was published, featuring a series of endearing animals with their young offspring. Like Circus, her illustrations avoided line work altogether, and the colour was applied with what appears to be a rough splattered technique using stencils. The results were visually engaging for young readers and quite devoid of the sentimental anthropomorphism seen in the work of many of her contemporaries. And another, titled Two Russian Tales, followed closely behind in that year and employed a similar stylistic approach, although in these images coloured line work was also evident. Both books featured the writing of the adopted son of Frans Helens, Alexandre van Ermengem, who was just 13 years old at the time. In 1935, Ivanovsky graduated from the theatre design course and had early success in this arena too, although all I've been able to find is a few animal costumes for a 1935 production of Le Roman de Renard. In 1936, The Legend of St. Nicholas was published with her striking graphic illustrations which used a limited palette of deep green and orange to produce aesthetically considered and highly attractive results. For this book, she had moved away from the earlier sprayed colour approach, and these illustrations were painted with flat opaque gouache. In the same year, she illustrated a children's version of the story Bast Bassina Boulou, which Frans Helens had originally published as a novel for adults some years earlier. For this edition, Ivanovsky supplied a series of particularly attractive, flat-coloured illustrations and graphic compositions using a bright primary palette and black, and many of them strongly evoked African art with great visual success. The story involved a carved tribal figure and its journey from its African origins into a European environment. Ivanovsky's images illuminated and enhanced this narrative considerably, and its enduring popularity led to it being published again 6 years later with the rather misleading title The Story of a Black Doll. Le Brunet, written by Henri Kubnik, was published in 1937, and once more Ivanovsky created absorbing flat colour compositions of great expressiveness, which made much greater use of backgrounds and scene setting than her other work to date. In 1938, she also illustrated the book Fauve de Baron de Fleurus, written by Henri Petrez. And for this project, she continued to use the more expected flat colour, Matisse-influenced style she had already had immense success with. But more significantly, it was at this time that she began a collaborative partnership with the female writer Marcelle Verité, which would endure for the best part of half a century. And this partnership provided the first evidence of Ivanovsky moving into a more overtly painterly technique. Nevertheless, 1940's Haute Mystérieuse, written by the Russian princess Anna Shcherbatov, saw a return to her more expected semi-abstracted folk art approach. Ivanovsky's illustrations combined black and white with gouache colour, applied both flat and texturally, with visually engaging results. 1941 saw the publication of Chansons populaires de Provence Belge, a series of traditional songs which were illuminated by Ivanovsky's collection of highly decorative gouache vignettes, complete with hand-lettered song titles. And in the following year she illustrated Four Tales from Hans Andersen, for which she made great use of a limited palette of only 3 colours, and again employed her fractured approach to composition and general disregard for perspective. A year later she created another similar collection of stories from the Brothers Grimm. She had first met the Belgian poet René Morand in the late 1930s, and between 1942 and 1946 they worked together on a series of 24 very small format books in a series collectively known as Pomme d'Api. The simple but highly attractive and amusing flat-coloured images ran across each double page set against the white page background with handwritten text. The books, printed by the publishers Éditions des Artistes, were cheap to produce and were extremely popular with children across continental Europe. And such has been the enduring nature of this charming series that all 24 books were published again in 2007 by Edition Memo, now with the title Les Tres Petits. They collaborated again with success on Bestiaire des Singes, also published in 1943. This collection contained 4-line verses and a series of highly accomplished and imaginative monochrome gouache painted vignettes of animal subjects. The end result was a thoroughly absorbing picture book which demonstrated the symbiosis of writer and illustrator to perfection. And in a remarkable burst of creative productivity, the same year also saw the publication of Conte Slovaque, rewritten by Leo Landsman, featuring yet more absorbing folk-tinged illustration from Ivanovsky. Although similarly styled to the earlier Pomme d'Api series, she produced another separate series of 4 larger format, visually engaging stories, all of which were published in 1944. 3 of the series featured jolly little woodland characters, and Ivanovsky obviously delighted in the creation of these simple flat colour images, printed on page white with the minimal handwritten captions. Every one of the double-page spreads presented a new scenario, and despite the woodland theme running through the first 3 books, she completely ignored background illustration altogether. The characters and props appeared against page white, and as a consequence they positively jumped off the page with a simplicity and innocence guaranteed to entertain and educate early learners. The odd book out in this quartet was the story of the circus bear, Ourson Acrobat, but it was no less engaging and attractive than the others. And given their timeless appeal, it's not surprising all 4 have also been reprinted for contemporary children. Ivanovsky and Morand not only enjoyed working together, but had by now become a couple, and in 1944 they married, and in the process she became a Belgian citizen. And within a couple of years they had produced 3 children. In 1948 she started working with Marcel Verité again on the book Conte Noir pour Enfants Blancs, with some painterly but far from representational illustrations of jungle scenes. And as prolific as they were collectively creative, their partnership also produced the far from typical Gardens Through the Ages, with some lyrical impressionistic images by Ivanovsky published in the same year. In 1949 their collaboration continued with another 2 books for children. The comical woodland fairy tale The Old Gentleman and the 6 Elves featured some particularly playful and endearing line and tonal watercolour wash images. And The King, the Bear and the Little Hedgehog also confirmed her newfound preference for tonally painted outcomes, in this instance with outline work in support. Despite these ongoing projects with Marcel Verité, Ivanovsky continued to create work independently of the partnership, and in 1950 she illustrated the songbook Refrains des Prés et des Bois, a collection of lyrics and musical scores set within expressively rendered vignetted scenes of woodland and domestic animals. In 1953 she returned to the work of Hans Andersen, this time for a more thorough collection than previously. And although most of the illustrations were printed with a limited palette, there were also a couple of full-colour illustrations. And the flat graphic approach she had used only a decade earlier was by now nowhere to be seen. The following year's Babouille et la Terre Promise, written by Frédéric Hébrard, was a consolidation of this transformation in her technique, and she used it to great effect in this story of a young lion who is taken from his home in the jungle to perform in a circus. But it was her continuing collaborations with Marcel Verité which most occupied her time and creative energies. The book Contes des Étoiles, just one of many others far too numerous to show here, was published in 1956, and she enhanced these stories from around the world with a series of remarkably well constructed and frequently exotic gouache painted illustrations. Such was the volume of work created by their partnership, the best I can do is pick out just a few representative highlights, such as Petit Ombre et Petit Parapluie, published in 1963. This book contained yet more highly decorative scenarios of woodland creatures, which, although far from anatomically realistic, exhibited only the most minimal of anthropomorphic aspects, and were highly plausible evocations of woodland wildlife to delight the pair's young and by now global readers. The similarly charming story of a little robin titled Petit Ami was published in 1965, and Le Voyage des Trois Pots, about the adventures of an apple, a pear and a pumpkin, appeared in 1967. Most significantly, between 1967 and 1970, Ivanovsky and Verité had one of their greatest successes with a series of no less than an astonishing 23 books about the little bird named Tip-Tip. This relentlessly attractive and imaginative collection of narrative images made particularly playful use of translucent washes of colour, applied selectively and impressionistically over her minimal expressive line work. And this large collection of illustrations, created some 4 decades after her first book, clearly showed her restless creativity had not diminished at all. In 1977, her husband René Morand died aged 71, and following this loss her previously jaw-dropping volume of creative output slowed considerably. 1985's My Little Animal Friends combined storylines about specific animal creatures with educational elements of natural history, and this was reflected in the more than usually representational but nevertheless attractively composed double-page spreads Ivanovsky created. Marcel Verité died in 1994, bringing to a close their remarkably productive 40-year association. The last dated book I found, and sadly only the cover, was L'Élixir du Révérend Père Gaucher in 1996, and Elizabeth Ivanovsky died 10 years later, at the age of 96 in Brussels in 2006. Since her death, quite a few of her early books have continued to be republished, and I for one find it remarkable how well they hold up against the contemporary competition, and show clearly how ahead of the curve in stylistic terms she was some 80 years ago. The dozens of books she created with Marcel Verité over several decades were particularly popular, and not just in Belgium or just in Europe for that matter. They've been translated into dozens of languages and have sold in great numbers all over the world. I've featured quite a few other illustrators on the channel whose work underwent radical stylistic transformations during their careers, but Elizabeth Ivanovsky is just about the only example I can think of who mutated from abstraction and simple graphic styling into more painterly representation, rather than the other way round. And much as I would be fascinated to know the motivation behind this transformation, Ivanovsky herself seems to have had nothing to say on the subject, so all I can do is continue to marvel at the volume, diversity and aesthetic merits of the illustrations she created.